Let's pick up where we left off in the previous video, talking about this Tosfot in Masechet Avodah Zarah. And what's striking about Tosfot, unlike Rambam, who made an abstract statement, blah blah blah, kulam of the Avodah Zarah. So he in abstract said this religion is Avodah Zarah. Tosfot instead gets into the minutia of how this specific isser of doing business with the Ovdei Avodah Zarah on their holidays would apply to their neighbors. And so first of all, they just observe the fact that people were violating it in their times. They say, so the Olam, the Welt, the people that we live with, our Jewish community, their custom is to engage in Masar Matan, to engage in commerce and trade on the holidays of our Gentile neighbors. And they give a bunch of suggestions we started reading last time. I don't care so much about what each suggestion is as to the overall fundamental point we're trying to get at here, which is you see their starting point, which obviously has to do with the context in which they live in Christian medieval Europe, is that it's simply not possible that their entire economy would have to shut down, every Sunday. It's just not, it can't be. And they tell you that no one is shutting down then. And based on that, they seem to be seeking different explanations for why that might be mutter. Now, someone might look at that, getting back to our fundamental discussion, and say, you know what? In a case like this, maybe there's something very problematic about what's going on in Tosfot, right? Where the rulings are influenced by time and place. Maybe the way we should look at halacha is that it's a system of laws and rules that need to be analyzed on the basis of abstract legal principles. And in that case, the Rambam does a very good job of that, right? The Rambam, based on the abstract concept of Avodah Zarah, he looks at the beliefs of what he calls Ha'umah HaNotzrit, and he says their beliefs, including, I don't think the issue is their belief in Mashiach. That doesn't make you Avodah Zarah to believe in a false Mashiach. But that same group that has that belief, that other things about them make it Avodah Zarah. So he's looking at it in abstract. He's talking about that nation with those beliefs. He's not talking about an individual person who is or is not his neighbor. Whereas Tosfot, they're talking about their neighbors with whom they, Ha'olam, here meaning their Jewish community, routinely interact, even on the holidays of their neighbors. And so that reality is presumably what's driving them to look for possible leniencies. And so one might look at that and say, oh, does that mean somehow that compromises the integrity of the Balei Tosfot, that they're not looking at this honestly and objectively? And I want to present a somewhat different perspective here, where I think the reality is that, and I wrote this in the comments that I circulated as well, I don't think halacha is meant to be an objective science quite to the same degree that some of the sciences that you study in your general studies are. It is true that fundamentally halacha is a series of legal principles, and the job of the posek is to apply those principles, but his job is to apply them to the situation that he sees in front of them, and that requires a lot of subjective judgment. That's why it's important to always bring your shalas to a posek whose judgment you trust to be sound judgment, and you feel will understand whatever situation you're presenting in front of him. And for that reason, Tosfot, they wouldn't say that we treat the legal principles of halacha with less respect. They would say we're trying to figure out how those principles are supposed to apply to Jews living in medieval Christian Europe, and that's something which Rambam isn't trying to do, because Rambam isn't living in medieval Christian Europe. And that, to give a more contemporary example, some of you may be familiar with something called the Heter Mechira, that in Israel, every 7 years, there's a Shemitah year. Jews cannot work the land during the Shemitah year. And so if you're a Jewish farmer on a kibbutz in Israel, that means real hardship for your kibbutz. It might even mean financial ruin. So Rav Kook, Rav Mitzvah Cohen Kook, who was the chief rabbi of Israel, the land of Israel, pre-state in the early 1900s, he staunchly supported, it wasn't his idea, but he staunchly supported an earlier sort of legal fiction, just like we sell our chametz, they're kibbutzim that sell their land to Gentiles for the Shemitah year, and in that way continue to work them in the Shemitah year. It's very controversial. I won't get into the details of why. There are certain very valid halachic reasons why some people object to that sale, But when I was in Gush, Rav Amital, one of my Roshei Yeshiva, told us an interesting story once that a certain Haredi rabbi who objected to Rav Kook's ruling on this matter said, Rav Kook, the reason he was so lenient on that matter was he had so much about Israel. He was so concerned about the well-being of these, Jewish farmers in pre-state Israel that it sort of blinded him to the objective legal principles governing the laws of Shemitah. If he'd been more sort of objective and balanced about it, he would have realized there are all kinds of red flags about that type of a sale. It's not clear if selling land to a non-Jew is effective. It's not clear if that gets the land out of the laws of Shemitah. And sort of Kook wouldn't have been able to rely on that if he'd been a little more fair and objective. So Rav Amital told us the story, and he said, honestly, I don't know that I consider that to be an insult towards Rav Kook. I think that Rabbi is correct that Rav Kook may have been influenced by his Ahavat Yisrael, but I think that's to Rav Kook's credit that as the chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael at that time, it was his responsibility to be concerned about how Jewish farmers in Eretz Yisrael were going to be able to put food on the table for their families even during a Shemitah year. And so, you're right, he didn't approach it like a cold-hearted scientist conducting an objective experiment in the legal principles of Shemitah and other mitzvot tliyot ba'aretz. Rather, he looked at it as, those principles were important. He tried to weigh them and weigh the different opinions of different earlier poskim about whether such a sale might work or might not work. He considered them in the context of these people who were not going to have anything to eat if he adopted the strict view. And Rav Amital felt that meant he was a good posek for his constituency, rather than feeling like he was, a poor technician in the laws of halacha. Again, these rulings require tremendous judgment. Rav Kook was an outstanding Talmid Chacham in the matters of halacha, even though we sometimes know him better for his accomplishments in Jewish philosophy. But weighing all the sources which he had complete mastery of in the context of pre-state Eretz Yisrael and the religious kibbutzim that were trying to survive there, that led him to a particular halachic ruling, which was, he felt was the right ruling for that time in that situation. And that in no way means that he, lacked integrity. On the contrary, it meant he was trying to appropriately navigate, the legal principles and the reality that appeared in front of him. One last thing I want to point out, which is kind of sort of a counterpoint to everything we've been discussing until now, is that you do have to be careful in this discussion to not get too carried away. I've sort of cherry-picked, I've dafka selected certain cases, both halachic examples and examples from Tanakh, from history in the cases we discussed the Saadia Gaon, where it's obvious, I picked cases where it's obvious the historical context of Saadia Gaon, or Tosfot, or even Rav Kook in the story that I told, was directly relevant to the thing they were discussing. But there's a danger of getting carried away. You have to realize not everything that it says in someone's sefer is necessarily tied to that person's historical context, and sometimes we're too quick to conclude someone said something based on his time and place, rather than simply assuming that he said it because it fit with what he was trying to say based on how he understood earlier. So to illustrate the need for this question, let's look at the first example on the sheet, which we did not do in class. Right? Rashi tells us over here, when Adam left Gan Eden, V'Adam Yadar Chava Ishto, that when Adam left Gan Eden, at that point, he had seemingly at that point he had relations with his wife Chava, and then Cain was born. Right? This English translation says that the man knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. But Rashi says not so fast. What does it really mean, V'Adam Yada? Really, it means Kfar Kodem Ha'inyan Shel Mala. It means earlier. Kodem Shachatav Nitrad Mi Gan Eden. Even before Adam left Gan Eden. Back when he was still in Gan Eden, Kena Herayon, Kena Leda. Adam and Chava had relations, Chava conceived, Chava gave birth to Cain. All of that happened earlier. And Rashi gives a grammatical reason. He says, She'im Katav Vayeda Adam, Nishma Shachar Nitrad Ha'ilu Banim. If it had said Vayeda Adam instead of V'Adam Yada, means of comparison, look a little later in the chapter when Cain has a child. We're told, Vayeda Cain ad Ishto, here in Pasuk Zayin. So that means that at that moment Cain had relations. V'Adam Yada, the non-Vavaypuch form, that doesn't mean past tense right here, that means a long time earlier. So this idea that Adam and Chava had relations in Gan Eden even before the sin also appears in a couple of midrashim that Rashi cites in earlier in Perek Gimel. For example, over here, we're told the Nachash was very sly. This appears right after the Torah had told us that Adam and Chava were naked. So Rashi says, Ma inyan zedachan? What does that have to do with anything? Right? What's the connection between Adam and Chava being naked and the snake being sly? It's explaining to you why the snake started up with them. What does the snake have against Adam and Chava? Because he saw Adam and Chava naked and having relations with each other, and because he saw them naked, being intimate with each other, he felt this desire for Chava, and that's why he wanted to separate her from Adam through this whole plot of getting her to sin. So Rashi quotes that Medrash, which teaches that Adam and Chava had relations in Gan Eden, and even before that, back in Perek Bet, when God creates woman, so we're told that before woman was created, Adam had been very lonely, and in that context, Rashi quotes this Medrash that initially Adam was very lonely. Adam lo matza ezer kenegdo, he couldn't find any appropriate partner, and then when God creates Chava, Adam realizes this is the one for him. He says, "L'zot yikarei isha," this one's going to be called woman. Zot hapa'am, this time I found the right one for me. What do you mean this time? What other times were there? What other partners did Adam have? So Rashi quotes this Medrash, Melamed sheba Adam al kol behema v'chaya v'lo nidkara da'ato behen. It comes to teach us that Adam had relations in some versions of the text, add the phrase ad sheba al chava, until he had relations with Chava. That he had tried to be intimate with other animals and never worked. And then woman is created, he has relations with Chava, and he realizes she's the one for him. So why is Rashi quoting all these midrashim about Adam and Chava having relations in Gan Eden? And then further emphasizing after Cain's born, they had relations in Gan Eden, that's when they conceived him. So some scholars have said, some more sort of historical scholars have said, look, maybe Rashi is driven here by his time and place. He's living in a Christian country where Christian clergy do not marry. And so Rashi is saying to himself, you know what? I want to make a point of my Jewish followers understanding that we in Judaism do not think it's a milah to be celibate. We don't think our rabbis shouldn't marry the way Christian priests don't marry. And so I'll show you that the reason we don't think that is because we don't think that sexual intimacy between men and women only began after the sin of the forbidden fruit. On the contrary, even before Adam and Chava ate from the forbidden fruit, when they were in their perfect, innocent state, before there was any sin in the world, they already were having relations with each other. And that's why, according to this historical approach, Rashi 3 times, right, in that Medrash in Perek Bet about how Adam tried to have relations with all these different animals, the Medrash in Perek Gimel about how the snake saw them having relations, and the beginning of Perek Daled talking about how Adam and Chava had relations and Cain was conceived and born in Gan Eden. He's saying again and again, this is all before the sin because we think it's fine for a married couple to have relations with each other even before there was original sin because we're in favor of that as appropriate behavior for everyone. And so that seems to work very nicely. That explainer Rashi keeps bringing it up. But we could also propose a counter-argument. The fact is that the ideas Rashi quoted in Perek Bet and Perek Gimel about the snake being jealous of Chava and Adam having relations with Chava after not being able to have relations and enjoy it with animals, all those things come from Midrashim. And so perhaps then, what's really going on here is it's not about historical context. Rather, we know that Rashi is very attached to the world of Chazal. He saw these 2 Midrashim. He may have wondered to himself whether they really fit with the plain sense of the text or not. And then he had this grammatical observation about the difference between the word yada over here versus the more common form vayeda later in the perek, vayeda Cain et ishto, and Cain has relations with his wife, which led him to believe that this phrase doesn't mean, as it says here, Adam knew, but rather that Adam had known, he had slept with Chava back in Gan Eden. And so he found this sort of grammatical proof to support an idea that he saw in various midrashim of Adam and Chava having relations in Gan Eden. It may be that what really drove him here was simply Rashi's general approach of being rooted in the world of Chazal and trying to find grammatical proof for it, and not necessarily its historical context. So as valuable as historical context is, we have to be careful not to go crazy and attribute everything to commentary's historical context.